APS C versus full frame. Huh? When you're looking for a new camera, there are so many things that you need to look at. One thing that you know you'll need to look at is megapixels. But there's also another very important part of the camera that is very important to consider when you're buying a camera, and that is sensor sizes. Hey everyone, thank you for clicking on the video, and if you're new here, my name is Lila, lovely to meet you. In this video, I'm going to explain everything you need to know about sensor sizes, how it affects the focal length of your lens, and I'll answer some questions that you may have about this topic. The first question we need to answer is, what is a camera sensor? Well, the camera sensor is one of the most important parts in a camera because it captures the light that comes in through the lens and it creates an image. You can compare it to film in old school cameras. However, nowadays on digital cameras, the sensor is mounted in the camera and the images are written on an SD card instead of on the film. There is one thing that's really important to understand when it comes to sensors, and that is the sensor size. As you know, a photo consists of millions of pixels, and the size of the pixels determines how much light is captured and how sensitive the camera is to light. If the pixels are bigger, the sensor captures more light, which means that it's more light sensitive, and this results in sharper and better quality photos and videos. I will come back to this in a bit, but first I want to explain to you the different sensor sizes. There are a few different types of sensors, such as CMOS and Light MOS, but what is more relevant and interesting to you are the sensor sizes. Let's start with the biggest sensor, which is the full frame sensor. Now, if you're looking to buy a new camera or you're watching YouTube videos from filmmakers, you will probably know, or you have noticed, or you heard them talk about the fact that they have a full frame camera. But what is a full frame camera exactly? A full frame camera means that it has a full frame sensor, which is equal to the 35mm sensor that you can find in old DSLRs that shoot film. What? Well, basically the first analog cameras had a sensor of 35mm, and now that the analog camera has made room for the digital camera, they manufactured an equal size sensor for the digital cameras, which is known as full frame. But to make it really easy, full frame is literally that you have all of the frame. You have the biggest picture or video that you can take. Now, why do I say the full image? Do you not get the full image when you use another camera that is not full frame? Well, it is a little bit complicated, but we're going to get into it right now. Because in the last decade or so, the demand for digital cameras has risen tremendously. The camera sensor is actually one of the most expensive parts of a camera to produce. So the bigger the sensor, the more expensive the camera will be. And because those bigger sensors are quite expensive to produce, and therefore the cameras are expensive, they came up with the idea to produce smaller sensors, because smaller sensors are cheaper to produce, which means that the cameras are cheaper. So yeah, that is why crop sensor cameras are cheaper than full frame cameras. Even though a crop sensor camera will cost you less, it also comes at a cost. The crop sensor. The crop sensor literally means that your image is cropped. So when you take a photo or a video on a full frame camera, you get the full frame. And then when you shoot a photo on a crop sensor camera, you will get only the middle part of that frame. Why? Well, because the sensor is smaller, so it's just not capable of capturing the entire thing. To visualize this, we take this photo, and this is the full frame. It was shot on a full frame camera. So this is the full thing that you see. But now, if we would take the same photo with a crop sensor camera, it will be cropped. So only the middle part of the entire image is what you will see when you take the same photo on a crop sensor camera. By how much your image will be cropped depends on the crop factor, and this is something that I'll go into later. First, I want to go back to the light sensitivity and the pixel size that I just touched on earlier. Because now we know what a full frame sensor looks like and a crop sensor looks like. The crop sensor is smaller than a full frame sensor. Now, it can be the case that both the full frame camera and the crop sensor camera have the same number of pixels. But because the full frame sensor is bigger, that means that the same number of pixels need to be spread out or kind of like stretched out over the entire sensor. This is not a bad thing, because bigger pixels mean that the sensor will capture more light, which means that it's more light sensitive, and that also means that it just performs better in low light situations. So this is actually a benefit of having a full frame camera. Let's talk about the most popular sensor size, which is the APS C sensor size. Honestly, I don't know what it stands for. I'll put it right here, but you can immediately forget about it because it's not important. All we need to know that it is APS C and it's a crop sensor size. Now, just to be clear, if in this video I say APS C camera or crop sensor camera, I mean the same thing. Because APS C cameras are the most common crop sensor cameras, I'm gonna use them interchangeably. And if I'm talking about another sensor, I will make that clear. But just so you know, if you hear me say APS C camera, it is because I'm referring to crop sensor cameras, in specific the APS C camera. Most entry and semi-professional cameras will have an APS C sensor. Now, the crop factor varies from brand to brand. For example, I know that Sony uses a crop factor of 1.5 and Canon uses a crop factor of 1.6. This is my old camera and it's a Canon 700D and it's an APS C camera. I have a lens of 18 to 55 millimeters, but because it has a crop factor of 1.6, that means that I need to multiply the focal length of 18 by 1.6, which will give me the equivalent result of a full frame camera with a lens at 29 millimeters. It is really important to understand that nothing changes about the lens. The lens is 18 to 55 and it will stay 18 to 55. Whether I put this lens on this camera or on my full frame camera, it stays the same. The difference is the sensor in the camera, which has a crop factor of 1.6. Basically, if I take the same photo on my full frame camera at 29 millimeters and on this camera at 18 millimeters, I should get a similar result. I didn't do it because I don't think it's a fair comparison because my full frame camera is way newer and this thing is pretty old. So also the megapixels are different, the quality is different, so that's why I didn't do it. But that is how it works. Although the lens stays the same, it is really important when you buy a new lens to take into consideration the crop factor. If you, for example, want to buy a wide angle lens and you think 60 millimeters is fine, you actually have to multiply that by the crop factor. So in that case, I would suggest to buy a 10 millimeter lens, because then if you multiply that by 1.6, in case you have a Canon, it gives you the equivalent look of 60 millimeters. Sometimes people refer to this crop effect as a zoomed in effect, but it's not really zooming in. So I want you to understand that it's not being zoomed in, but because it is cropped, it does look like it's zoomed in. This is really important to remember when it comes to sensor sizes. The smaller the sensor size, the bigger the crop factor. Another popular but less common sensor size is the micro four thirds. This is a quarter of the size of a full frame camera and it has a crop factor of 2. The brands Panasonic and Olympus use these sensor sizes in their cameras. If you're looking at compact cameras like this one, for example, you have different sensor sizes and the 1-inch sensor size is the biggest sensor size among these cameras. Therefore, a compact camera with a 1-inch sensor will produce the best quality among the compact cameras. Now, the most common one is the 1 to 2/3 to, I'll put it on the screen, is this one, which you will find in most compact cameras like this one. And in this case, with those kind of sensors, the smaller the sensors, the more limited the image quality is. Now, I'm not saying that the image quality is bad. I mean, I've had a blast with this one. They actually take really good photos, but compared to the 1-inch sensor, the quality is limited. Alright, so now that I hopefully clarified all this, the big question is, what sensor size should I go for? Should I go for full frame because it is the biggest sensor, so it will capture the biggest image and the biggest video and best light and everything? Well, no, not necessarily. Today's APS C cameras are actually really good, and I doubt whether you will see a significant difference when you're using, like I said, for example, a 10mm lens on an APS C camera or a 16mm lens on a full frame camera. I actually think that the APS C cameras win in terms of price and in terms of that zoomed in look, for example, when you're taking photos of wildlife. For example, if you have a telelens of 200 milliliters, because, for example, if you have a telelens of 200 millimeters and you put that on an APS C camera And if in this case the APS C camera is Sony and it has a crop factor of 1.5, it's actually 300 millimeters, or at least equivalent to 300 millimeters on a full frame camera. If you want to take wider shots, yes, a full frame camera can be advantageous. However, like I said, you can compensate the crop factor of an APS C camera by taking a wider lens. So, for example, a 10mm lens instead of a 50mm lens if you have a Sony, or a 10mm lens instead of a 60mm lens on a Canon APS C. Whether you use an APS C camera or a full frame camera in daylight, it doesn't really make any significant difference, to be honest. You will notice a difference when you are in a low light situation and you use a full frame camera. I think that is where a full frame camera definitely wins. Of course, the full frame camera also wins in terms of quality, but like I said, I don't think that you will notice such big of a difference, and I'm not sure if it's worth the money, but it depends on where you are and what your purpose is. I'm not going to tell you whether you should go for an APS C camera or a full frame camera, but I do think that if you're a hobbyist or you're looking for a new camera for your YouTube videos, an APS C would, in my personal opinion, be a more sensible choice because of the money. Your kit will be smaller, and like I said, you can easily compensate the focal length of the lens. Also, if you want to be professional, you don't necessarily need a full frame camera. It depends on your style, it depends on your preferences. There are a lot of factors involved. Trust me, the whole full frame and APS C and micro four thirds is kind of confusing, but I hope after watching this video it's not that confusing anymore. If you really want to take advantage of your camera, make sure to hit subscribe, because I make camera tutorials as well as videography tutorials, and drop a comment if you want to say hi, or if you have a question, make sure to drop a comment so I can help you. I hate my neighbors. Why do they start doing their laundry when I'm trying to make a video?